Hi, I'm BJ, and this is the Arcane Alienist Podcast. Well, it's August, so it's time again for RPG A Day, for 2022 edition. This is put together by Anthony Boyd of the no relation, the Casting Shadows blog and podcast, also known as Runeslinger, about the internet. And so the challenge is there's a topic or an idea for every day in the month of August, and the challenge is for content creators, whether it's blogs, podcasters, artists, anybody kind of involved in some way or another in creating content for role playing games to contribute something every day. Last year I couldn't publish every day, so sometimes I'd have one short one a day, and sometimes I'd miss a couple of days and I'd hit three at once. I think this year I'm going to take a page. I know Jason is doing this, and we'll hear from Jason of the Nerds RPG Variety Cast a little bit later in the show. I think he's trying to tackle them just a week at a time. So I'm gonna go through the first, and each week has it seems like these questions that are posed for each day are related week to week. So I think doing it a week at a time will still give for a standard conversation. And this is going to lead into some kind of the general topic for today, which is gaming with kids. But let's take a look at the questions first, and I'll answer them as best I can from my end. So, question for August 1st: who would you like to introduce to role playing games? Well, for me, I'd like to introduce anybody who would like to be introduced. I'm always up for bringing new people into the hobby and helping people feel comfortable and have a good time. But of interest to me right now is introducing younger people to role-playing games, specifically kind of junior high, high school aged kids. And the reason is I'm actually in 2 weeks going to start a new campaign with that age range. I mean, people around, I think 12 or 13 up through 18, 19 years old. Because what had happened is somebody I know had tried to kind of get a game going for some people in that age range, and ran one session and felt like he was in over his head because he'd never played D&D before. So he asked if I would run them through the starter set, The Lost Mines of Phandelver, so he could play and learn, kind of experience the game as a player, and maybe also start to learn how to run games himself. So I'll be doing that. My son is going to join me. I've ran him through The Lost Mines of Phandelver before. Again, at the same time with a group of kids in that same general age range. He was a little younger, but so maybe not that same general age. These are going to be, like I said, 12 to 18. I think the first time I ran with him, it was more like 11 to 15. The ages of the kids in the group. So I've done it before. I'm comfortable with it. But to answer the question for August 1st, who would you like to introduce role playing games to? This would be teenagers, basically. What is a great for August 2nd? What is a great introductory RPG? I think it probably depends on the game master. If you have a pretty good mastery of any system, if the GM is comfortable enough with the system to very quickly explain the rules, very quickly answer questions, and be able to monitor how the players are using whatever skills, abilities, mechanics are on their character sheets, and kind of give them some pointers and loop them in and get them going, I think any game, or maybe not any game, most RPGs can probably be good introductory RPGs. If I had to pick one, I would probably things that are on the shelf today, as much as I love Old School Essentials, I would use Old School Essentials because I can explain the rules and the concepts. But if I was going to tell somebody grab something off the shelf, I don't know if Old School Essentials, as written in the book, because it's just a reference manual, really does kind of what the old BX books did as far as kind of teaching you how to play the game. So I might recommend Old School Essentials plus watch some videos on YouTube about how to play the game. Or I might recommend White Box, which is, the original D&D, and a version of originals. Well, it's not the original D&D. It's Swords and Wizardry. The Swords and Wizardry version of the original D&D. That has a simpler and straight enough, forward enough rules that I think you can grab it and very quickly start to get a feel for how to run the game. If if you don't have an experienced GM. With an experienced GM, I think it's the GM's preferred system, and anything can be a great introductory role-playing game. When were you first introduced to RPGs? I was, I believe, in the 8th grade. One of my best friends had started playing with some of the older kids who were in high school, and basically he would play as a player with them, and then he would run his own campaign with me and a couple of our other friends that were in the 8th grade. And I eventually befriended those same people he was playing with, and would go on to play with those guys throughout high school. And that was the nostalgia of this season's Stranger Things with the Satanic Panic in the 80s, and then the high school kids introducing the junior high kids to the game, and all that. That just really hit home for me. But that's how I got started with introduced. It was we were playing kind of first edition, and then I played that. I didn't have any books. I just kind of sat and showed up, and here's your character sheet, and we would play. But then after about a year of that, I think the second edition came out, and that's when I first started buying role-playing games. Where would you host a first game? Again, I think it depends on the group. If it's people you're real comfortable with and they're people you can bring them over to your house. Otherwise, I know, your friendly local game store, if you have one. Where I live, unfortunately, we do not. The library is an option. Interestingly enough, just talking about the Satanic Panic, the group of kids I'm about to go teach D&D are actually a youth group at the local Methodist church here where I live. And this is the youth director that's asked me to come do this. So I guess we won in the long term. The D&D won. We're now being played in churches without any kind of accusation of Satanism or witchcraft. Why will they like this game? Well, it's Dungeons and Dragons. Why would you not like it? I think it's good for some laughs. It's good for adventure. It's good to hang out with your friends. It's a good exercise in using your imagination. And I particularly like playing. I like playing with everybody. One of the things I like playing about with kids in this range is they're fairly, if they're not brand new to the game, they haven't done a lot of tabletop role playing. This is kind of early in the hobby, and they don't have a lot of assumptions about how it should and shouldn't be. They're just wide open for the experience. And so sometimes they come up with some pretty creative solutions. Even when you play more of a rules-heavy game like 5th edition or Pathfinder, because they don't know the rules. They're just like, hey, I want to do this. How do I do it? And you as the game master can help them sort out how they might go about accomplishing it. And finally, how would you get more people playing role-playing games? I think we're at a place where people who enjoy role-playing games can talk about, just like other people, like, oh, I do woodworking. Well, I knit and crochet. Oh, I play Dungeons and Dragons. You don't have to be embarrassed or ashamed that that's your hobby anymore. Next year we've got a major D&D motion picture that looks like it's got good production values and named actors that people will recognize, and that they've tried to make an entertaining movie, as opposed to that sort of. Oh man, I was so angry when I walked out of the theater in that first D&D movie. What was it, 20 or so years ago? I can't remember what year that came out. It was so bad. This looks like they've tried to make this other one a good movie that a wider audience will like and that will be successful. So how do you get more people into role-playing games? Be open about the fact that you're role-playing and what it's like and what you enjoy about it. And I think, that's kind of me. I'm just always open to talk to people who are interested and invite them to enjoy games when I have time, and offer to run games for them in my spare time. So that's how I go about doing it. If anybody else has any thoughts on that, just give me a call, let me know. That's part of what RPG A Day about, is generating these discussions and having these exchanges of ideas. So that leads me to the topic I really wanted to talk about. I've been meaning to do this for a while. It's interesting that the first sort of set of questions for RPG A Day kind of dovetailed nicely with this. and even before I was asked to step in and run this game that I'm about to, I have been wondering about where we are right now, and how new people and younger people are coming into the hobby through seeing live plays on YouTube and listening to podcasts, and then seeing it more prominently displayed. When you go to Barnes and Noble, it's not tucked off in a little corner anymore. There's Critical Role is now got an animated series on Amazon. There's a movie coming out. Target carries D&D stuff on its shelves. So it's much more in the public eye and much more maybe accessible than it's been in a long time. And so naturally you're going to get younger people. It's not just a bunch of old people in their 40s and 50s that children of the 70s and 80s playing anymore. I mean, you got kids who are in junior high now, 12, 13, who are getting into the game. And so I've been thinking about it for a while because, like I mentioned, a few years ago, I did run the starter set for some younger players. And one of the things I noticed in sort of their approach, and I think it's reflected in some of the aesthetics that maybe some of the older grognard crowd don't like about 5th edition D&D, Pathfinder, 2E, is what's your reference point for what fantasy is? And I took the opportunity while I was on vacation. This is by no means a scientific poll, but I just asked. I had along with my son who's 13, I had my nieces and nephews there, so we've got kids ranging from 12 to the oldest one is 19. Actually, he just turned 20 now that I think about it. And I'm very proud of him. He's in college, and he is the president of the Tabletop Role-Playing Game Association for the very large university that he attends. So I'm way to go, kid. Anyway, but I asked them all, when you think of fantasy, what do you think? And I didn't tell them what I was, good psychologist. I didn't tell them why I was asking the question. I just threw it out there while we were kind of eating dinner one night. And their reference points, and I kind of predicted this is what would happen, were not the reference point of the old school crowd that probably mostly listens to the podcast and that calls in and stuff. Their reference point for fantasy, Star Wars. They mentioned Star Wars. They mentioned Harry Potter, which I knew they would mention. Percy Jackson. They mentioned video games like Skyrim, Legend of Zelda. They mentioned what else did they talk about? Pokemon. And then some things I had to say. Wait a minute, what is that? I have never heard of that. And inevitably it was some kind of young adult fiction or anime. And so that's going to give you, if that's the new Appendix N, if that's the Appendix N, if you're going to create D&D in the year 2022, that's very, okay. They all did mention the Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones as well. Some of the older ones mentioned Game of Thrones anyway, not the younger ones. But for the most part, that body of work is going to give you something very different than thinking about Michael Moorcock, Robert Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, H.P. Lovecraft, L. Sprague de Camp. Those that kind of pulp fiction fantasy that informs a lot of Gary Gygax's Appendix N on kind of those foundational things that he cited as reference. Why do I bring that up? Well, I think if you're going to play with younger folks, it's good to, and again, if you are kind of at my age, if you're in your 40s or older and are going to be playing with younger people, and I'm not even just talking about teenagers, people in their 20s and 30s have different reference points for the kind of fantasy they grew up with that sparked their imagination. You need to understand they don't, it's not that they don't care or they're irreverent to the kind of fantasy you may have grown up in, enjoying. So they don't even know about some of it. When I said, have you guys ever heard of it? They knew who Conan was, but they didn't know about Robert Howard as an author, and more, they're thinking of Conan from movies. Michael Moorcock. They knew Dune. I asked them about Dune. Of course, Dune's been prominent because of the movie last year. But ask them about some of those authors and those stories that come from that old appendix, and they just know. And I'm like, well, you guys should check some of these out because they're really great. Age appropriate, of course, for some of your older kids. But their reference point when you say you're going to make a character in a fantasy world, they're going to be expecting to be Harry Potter. They're going to expect to be Link. They're going to expect to be Luke Skywalker or Rey, even from the new. I think the younger generation also is a little more appreciative of the new Star Wars movies than maybe we are. Those are the characters they're going to be thinking about, not Conan and Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser and Elric. So that's going to inform kind of the way they role play. If they get a little deeper into role play about talking in character or really talking about acting out their character's motivation or creating backstories for their character, their assumptions about what a fantasy setting entails, those are all going to be informed by these newer sorts of fantasy. And even myself, growing up in the 80s, I mean, some of the authors that I really enjoyed in the 80s, there's the D&D fiction like Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman and R.A. Salvatore that wrote novels based on D&D as a foundation. But I'm thinking of like David Eddings in particular was a big one for me. And I know some of the other ones that I haven't read all these people, but I've read the first book in Wheel of Time, so you think of David Eddings, Robert Jordan, Terry Brooks. Those are all fantasy that have come post the invention of D&D, and so there may be people for that's kind of in the mix of their thoughts on fantasy setting as well. So be mindful of kind of the age cohort and the kind of media your players grew up with, it because that may very much inform and guide their expectations for what a game is like. And you could say, hey, let me tell you a little more about this setting. It may be different from what you're thinking. Let's make sure we're on the same page. But also, I think it's fun to embrace that, to embrace kind of where your players are coming from and their expectations and what they contribute with their imaginations, and not shut them down and say, well, the only way to play D&D is the, pathetic farmhand, who's probably going to die tomorrow, but if he gets lucky, he'll make it to eventually make it to second level and probably still going to die tomorrow after that. But you know what I mean? Some older players really enjoy the grim dark and the pathetic aesthetic and stuff like that. But I don't know that that's what, and there are probably younger players who do as well, but I don't think that's where a lot of them are coming from. Now I've probably said that 20 times in the last 10 minutes. So anyway, those are my kind of thoughts on playing with kids, particularly teenagers, because that's the next big endeavor I've got coming up, in addition to the other role-playing games that I've always got going on. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on that. I'd love to hear some feedback from anybody else who has played with kids. There's always the practical stuff of playing with kids in terms of where they are in terms of their emotional and social development, and that may be a little more consistent across time, because they're kids, they're teenagers. But then there's also the cohort differences of what was it like playing with teenagers who were teenagers in the 90s? What was it like playing with them in the early aughts versus what it's like playing with them now? I think I commented to somebody the other day that I think a lot of the horror DM stories you hear from kind of people my age, we don't ever stop to think that part of the reason that all went bad is because everybody was immature. Nobody had fully developed frontal lobes. We're talking about a 15-year-old kid running D&D for a bunch of 13-year-old kids. And so when a DM's on a power trip or somebody has done something really, looking back, you think, man, how stupid was that? Well, it's because as teenagers, they don't they're still learning how to manage these kinds of situations. It's not the game, and it's not, you know, even the people involved were good or bad people. It's that they were immature. Anyway, let me know your stories, your thoughts about gaming with and for and as teenagers. I'd love to hear more about that from everybody out there. All right, that said, we're going to move on to some calls. First, we've got calls from Anthony of Casting Shadows, who has, again, the man behind RPG A Day, and he's got some calls about previous episodes. And then after that, we'll hear a little bit from Jason Connerly of the Nerds RPG Variety Cast. So here we go, Anthony.
Hey BJ, Anthony here from Casting Shadows. I just finished listening to your Ancient Peoples episode. I really enjoyed it. I've been meaning to call in, but often the car is so noisy with somebody coughing or, three dogs in unison panting over my shoulder that, I just don't feel like doing it, and then the opportunity passes. So anyway, I wanted to call in previously about your comparison between the different temples of elemental evil. I'm not a D&D player, but still that kind of comparative game study plus play and enjoyment and recap, that's just right up my alley. I really like to see how that plays out, and I've recommended those episodes to friends. But this episode about ancient peoples was really cool. The site that you're describing, I've only experienced through movies and, magazine articles and things like that. It's really interesting to hear the thoughts of someone who has visited more than once and over a long period of time. And I think the advice that you're giving for world building is really solid and inspiring. Playing with how language works is of particular interest to me, living in a foreign country and constantly encountering things about language that make your life more interesting. So, yeah, right on. Thanks a lot for sharing.
Well, thank you for the kind words, Anthony, and thanks for recommending the Temple of Elemental Evil episodes to other people. I think we're about to get to a point where I can do another one. I can't do them every week because I want to let the two groups get to kind of a comparable point in the adventure where I can compare what they've done in tackling similar obstacles, and also for the few of them that listen to the podcast, I'm not spoiling anybody's upcoming session by recapping the previous session where the other group is working on the same phase of the adventure. But I think we're getting close to where I can provide another update on that. And yeah, the language and history and all how that stuff flows together in a setting is great. Maybe you'll get to visit the cliff dwellings someday. I'm sure there are plenty of interesting places in Korea where you are, where you can go back and look at the ancient history of the people who lived there and how their cultures have changed over time and the marks they've left. That'd be something I'd like to hear more about sometime if I ever get a chance to read up on it, or if you want to call in and tell me a little about it, feel free to. And thanks again for the call. And hey, here we go with RPG A Day for 2022. Thanks also for always putting that together.
Hey, BJ, Jason here. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the point about the technology levels, because in your talk about ancient peoples, because in most games, when people find ancient civilization or abandoned civilization, it ends up being more advanced than the civilization, the people finding it, right? But how often do we have them finding a less advanced? Although it does happen. I think you brought up a ton of great points just across the board, and I think these are the kind of things that really develop a world, like you say. They really make the world feel lived in and feel like it has a history. And things like having where you don't know the right name of the people, and we call them orcs, but they have their own name for themselves, or whatever. And then of course each clan of orcs might have a different name that they call each other. So yeah, 100%. I think you nailed it, and I'm glad you had a great vacation. It's funny. I was listening to a program on buffalo, which what we call buffalo in America, really bison. They're really different species. They're not buffalo and bison are not the same thing, but of course we're always going to call them buffalo. The only true buffalo are, in Africa and Asia, you have like Cape buffalo, water buffalo, which are totally different than bison. But the white man definitely helped destroy the bison herds. There's no question about that, and they were a big part of that. But it probably would have happened anyway. There's more and more evidence, and you get stories. There were groups of Indians when they were fighting with each other that would kill bison and just leave the carcasses to rot and not use them, just to spite the other tribe and to chase them off, and there was overhunting in some degrees. And then, of course, the final thing that killed them after the white man really thinned the herds down was the winter. They went too far north into Canada, and the cold killed a ton of them. So while there's no question the bison were going to be killed off one way or another, well, let me say that differently. There's no question the white man super hastened the downfall of the bison. No question about it. They were kind of on that trajectory on a much slower, curve, but they were eventually going to get there anyway. But yeah, the rivalries between tribes and things like that, and that's definitely something you can play up in a game with the factions and playing factions against each other, and that's something that's been in D&D since the beginning. A lot of your early modules have encounters where you encounter different factions and dungeons, and you can play them off each other. So it goes back to the early days of the hobby. Even look at Blackmoor. You could do that in Blackmoor, and because all the players are effectively their own faction to some degree.
Hey, Jason, thanks for the messages. Yeah, I think I like world building. I always never know how much any given player enjoys encountering the world building, but it helps me at least understand the world and know some of the ancient history, as I alluded to before. The ancient history of North America is very fascinating. Again, like I mentioned with the descendants of the ancient Pueblo, you have to you can't just toss out the oral histories of the tribes here because they didn't have a written language. You need to listen to the stories they have and understand that that's written history is not always exact, not always accurate itself. I don't think we should say written history is perfect and oral history needs to be thrown out. But listening to the stories, and particularly when we can compare them to sort of modern sciences, and then you can get some corroboration, some triangulation of information. Not that I would ever toss out the truths that people have of their cultural heritage and their history of where they came from and who their ancestors were. That would be completely inappropriate. I would never do that with my own Cherokee nation that I'm a part of, or with any other Indian nation. But to say it's also nice to get that to see when you can look at archaeology and other sites as it sort of are in agreement or can kind of further emphasize kind of the history. But actually, I'm getting to, you mentioned, the buffalo, and they may have been on a certain trajectory because of climate change and the lands they live in, plus tribes competing with each other, as well as just the steady incremental increase of a population means that there's more man's on the resources. So those are interesting things to look at and to study and to hear about and to think about. I think what's really fascinating in the eastern, North America is there are writings from, European settlers and explorers who talk about this. God has blessed this land for us because, unlike Europe, there are whole groves of the same tree where we can just walk around and pretty easily gather up the nuts and the fruits. And there's certain plants that are edible or desirable. And it never occurred to them that those may have been the native people who were there first, selectively planting trees and plants, even though they may not have been creating them in farms and orchards the way you would think of in Europe. They were modifying the environment to make it a little easier for them to gather food and to find the things they needed to sustain themselves. So it's always important to look at all sides of the history, the natural history, the social and political and cultural history of a place. And I think that you're right, that makes, just like that, so much increases our understanding of the world we live in, the real world. it makes a fictional world that you would use to tell stories or to engage in role-playing games that much more richer. So I appreciate the thoughts there, and here Jason's got a couple more comments from the previous episode.
Hey, BJ, Jason again. So, in reference to the calls on your last episode, the Ancient Peoples episode, and backstories, yeah, I think if I was Rob, I would run with the player who thought that they were Odin's librarian, and I would play with that. And, they're going to find out they weren't really Odin's librarian, but it was, somebody posing as Odin, right? It was a mage or an illusionist posing as Odin, sending them out to get magic items and artifacts for them. But, it ends up just being a guy pretending to be, kind of Wizard of Oz kind of situation. I think I would definitely do that. Which does that mean? Would that be taking away that player's agency by doing that? Because the player's being just ridiculous, saying they work for Odin in the first place. So I think a little turnabout's fair play. As far as backstories and sandboxes, it's funny because over on the RPG Pub forum a while ago, there was a discussion about random character creation versus like point buy and directed character creation. And one of the guys on there was talking about, or one of the posters, I should say, over there was talking about, if you don't have developed backstories and characters built, then they couldn't run a sandbox because they need that to build the world. And that's nuts. You can start with blank sheets, no backstory to the characters in a sandbox, just put up missions on a mission board like the 5e starter set, and as they do those basic missions and their backstories develop, then weave those stories into the campaign. It's really not that hard to do. GMing, maybe 201 at that point, right? I rarely will build a campaign or rarely build sessions, the initial session with character backstories, just kind of irrelevant. Now, I will weave them into the game. So like when we did that last Barbarians of Lemuria campaign, we did weave in the backstories of the characters into the campaign. Unfortunately, that campaign got cut short, and we had a bunch of absences and missed games, but the plan was to weave everybody's backstory in at some point, and I got to weave like Joe's in, but like I say, unfortunately, real life and the internet gaming scene kind of got in the way. But yeah, I definitely think you can weave the backstories developed during the game. You can weave it in the progress of the game. You don't have to have it ahead of
time. I don't think that's removing a player's agency. I think one of the things I've always said is you have to acknowledge that the DM is a player. They have a very different role from the other players, but they're still playing the game. I mean, they're refereeing the game and they're managing the game, but they're also still kind of playing the game. It has to be fun and interesting for the game master. And the setting is the game master's character. Now, I feel like game masters deserve a little bit of leeway. They don't need to railroad players. They don't need to remove player agency, but they do have since they're not getting to just sit and immerse themselves in one character and have fun with that the way players do, the setting and the history of the setting and the layout of the setting and the events that are kind of shaping the setting, those are the DM's. That's the DM's character. And so I think just like players need to respect each other's characters, I think players need to a little bit respect the DM's setting or scenarios that they're presenting. Now the DM's setting is supposed to react to the players and let the players' decisions have meaning. So it's not that you're just going to go along on a railroad, or I'm telling a story and you're just going to, you're actors and I'm the director telling you what to do in this scene as opposed to you making your own decisions. We don't want to get into that. But yeah, I think I mentioned when Rob had talked about that huge backstory. I mean, I think you cross a line when players are basically inserting, unless you've talked about this at the beginning and this is the kind of game you want to play, because there are a lot of games like this, like a lot of Fate games start this way, where everybody builds a setting together and then they play. That's cool. But if you're not playing that kind of game, it's sort of build a character you're interested in playing, but kind of use the parameters that the scenario or the campaign setting the DM is giving you to work from. And I just think that allows for GMs to have fun, and it's a it lets everybody play their proper role. I don't think that's removing the player's agency would be. You do work for Odin, and whenever you don't do anything that I like, Odin shows up and makes a course correction that you have no choice in, and he's literally the Deus Ex Machina, the God in the machine. He shows up and fixes things when you've got so screwed up that you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, right? That would be taking away their agency. And I know you were kind of half joking with that when you mentioned agency. I agree. You don't need much of a background to start a sandbox game. People kind of get a sense of who their characters are, and as they tell a little more about who they think their characters are, you can start to work that into the sand. That's the nice thing about a sandbox. It's ever evolving. Everything's subject to change. You haven't really hung your hat on any major outcome or event. It's just them visiting location to location, seeing what's going on there. So, great points all around. I appreciate, as always, your calls, and I'll talk to you later. Well, that's it for this episode. I want to thank my callers, Jason Connerly of the Nerds RPG Variety Cast. You can find his podcast on Anchor and most other podcasters, as well as Anthony Boyd of Casting Shadows. Also, you can find his podcast on Anchor and most other podcatchers. Be sure to also check out his blog, castingshadowsblog.com, I believe is the address on that. I'll put a link in the show notes. And, Google RPG A Day 2002, the hashtag, and see what other people are putting together stuff for all through the month of August to help further more conversation and discussion about all the things that are great about role-playing games. All right, wherever you are out there, take care of yourself, be well, and I'll be back with another episode later on. Thanks for listening to the Arcane Alienist podcast. The music you're hearing is Come and Get It by Scott Holmes Music. The cover art I use for the episodes is by Dave Bone. Be sure and check out his website, ironseer.com, for a lot of other great gaming-related content. You can always leave me a voice message through the Anchor app or at the Anchor website, or you can email me at arcane.alienist@gmail.com. Once again, I appreciate you listening. Thanks so much.